Red and blue lights reflected off the manicured oaks of the exclusive enclave, casting long, frantic shadows across the concrete. Elena, a federal prosecutor who had spent her entire career putting dangerous criminals behind bars, was about to become a casualty of the very justice system she revered. She had the penal code memorized, but in the dark of her own driveway, the law did not matter. Only the color of her skin did. What started as a simple, unjustified demand for identification escalated into a shattered career, a rigged trial, and an unbelievable prison sentence. Elena Whitaker rubbed her temples, trying to massage away the dull ache radiating behind her eyes. At 34, Elena was one of the youngest and most formidable assistant United States attorneys in the district. For many months, she had been building a massive, sprawling RICO case against a syndicate of fentanyl distributors, a case that had consumed her nights, her weekends, and her peace of mind. Finally turning onto the quiet street, she let out a long exhale. The neighborhood was an affluent, quiet suburb characterized by sprawling lawns, colonial-style homes, and a pervasive sense of insulated security. It was the kind of place where the biggest scandal was a poorly trimmed hedge. Elena had purchased her 4-bedroom home here years earlier, a tangible reward for her relentless work ethic and unyielding dedication to public service. She pulled into her driveway, the gravel crunching softly beneath her tires, and shifted the car into park. She was running purely on adrenaline and lukewarm precinct coffee. Gathering her thick leather briefcase, filled with redacted grand jury transcripts, she stepped out into the crisp night air. Before she could even lock her car door, a spotlight hit her. It was blinding, a brilliant white beam that washed out the world around her, leaving her squinting and raising a hand to shield her eyes. The low, heavy rumble of a police cruiser's engine idled at the curb, stealthy and predatory. It had not used its sirens, merely crept up the street with its headlights off until the exact moment Elena exited her vehicle. "Step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them," a voice barked over a PA system. Elena froze, her prosecutor's mind immediately trying to categorize the situation. Was this a mix-up? A stolen vehicle report matching her car? "Officer!" she called out, her voice steady and authoritative, projecting the same confidence she used in federal court. "Is there a problem? I live here." A heavy car door slammed shut. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel, approaching her with deliberate, aggressive speed. As her eyes adjusted to the glaring spotlight, the silhouette of a uniform materialized. It was Officer Harlan Tate, a heavily built patrolman with a severe, angular jaw and a hand resting casually, yet terrifyingly, on the butt of his holstered service weapon. "I said step away from the car," Tate snapped, closing the distance until he was mere feet from her. His eyes swept over her, a black woman in a wrinkled charcoal pantsuit standing next to an expensive luxury vehicle, in a neighborhood where the demographics skewed overwhelmingly, almost exclusively white. "I heard you, officer," Elena replied, maintaining her ground but keeping her hands visible. "I'm asking you why you are on my property. This is my home. I just got off work." "Right, work," Tate scoffed, his tone dripping with immediate, unfiltered skepticism. "At this hour, let's see some identification." "I am an assistant United States attorney," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the unyielding register she reserved for hostile witnesses. "My ID is in my purse, which is sitting on the passenger seat of my car. If you'd like to see it, I need to reach inside." "Do not reach into that vehicle," Tate commanded, his voice rising, his body tensing. He unclipped the retention strap on his holster. The sharp snap echoed in the quiet neighborhood like a firecracker. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but her training kept her rooted. She knew the statistics. She knew how quickly these encounters spiraled into tragedy. "Officer Tate," she said, reading his silver name tag. "Look at my license plate. Run it. It's registered to Elena Whitaker at this exact address. You are conducting an unlawful stop on private property without reasonable suspicion. I am simply trying to go to sleep." You don't tell me how to do my job, Tate growled, stepping into her personal space. The smell of stale spearmint gum and metallic brass hit her. We've had a string of burglaries in this area. You fit the description of a suspect. A burglary suspect in a tailored suit driving a luxury car. Elena countered, the absurdity of the situation momentarily overriding her caution. Are you listening to yourself? Turn around, Tate ordered, hands on the roof of the car. No, Elena stated firmly. I am not under arrest, and you have no probable cause to detain me. I am going inside my house. She turned her body slightly toward her front door. It was the natural, instinctive movement of a woman exhausted and frustrated by a blatantly prejudiced encounter. But to Officer Tate, it was the trigger he had been waiting for. I said turn around, Tate lunged. He did not just grab her arm. He seized her by the shoulder of her blazer and violently yanked her backward. The sudden force caught Elena completely off guard. Her heavy leather briefcase slipped from her grasp, hitting the driveway and bursting open. Hundreds of pages of confidential federal documents, witness testimonies, and surveillance logs scattered across the cold concrete like dead leaves. Get your hands off me! Elena shouted, her professional composure finally shattering under the sheer physical violation. She instinctively pulled her arm away from his grip. Stop resisting! Tate bellowed, his voice echoing through the silent, wealthy neighborhood. He swept her legs out from under her. The world tilted violently. Elena hit the hood of her car hard, the metal groaning under the impact. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. Pain flared in her ribs. Before she could process the shock, Tate shoved his forearm into the back of her neck, pinning her face against the cold windshield. I am not resisting, she gasped, tasting blood where she had bitten her own lip on impact. You are assaulting a federal officer. You are going to lose your badge for this. Shut up, Tate spat, pulling her right arm forcefully behind her back. Across the street, porch lights flickered on. The commotion had awakened the street. The front door of the house directly opposite hers cracked open. A woman in a floral robe stepped out onto the porch. It was Martha Ellison, the head of the neighborhood HOA. A woman Elena had cordially exchanged pleasantries with just days prior about the upcoming neighborhood block party. Martha! Elena cried out, her cheek pressed agonizingly against the glass. Martha, tell him I live here. Martha stood on her porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked at Elena, pinned and bleeding, and then looked at Tate. The older woman's face hardened into a mask of nervous hostility. Officer, Martha called out into the night, her voice trembling with misplaced righteousness. Officer, I've never seen that woman before in my life. Be careful. She might have a weapon. I'm calling 911. The betrayal felt like a physical blow, sharper than the pain radiating from her shoulder. Elena stared at her neighbor in pure disbelief. I helped you find your lost golden retriever last month, Elena thought, her mind spinning into a vortex of despair. You know exactly who I am. But the lie was all Tate needed. The neighbor's deliberate failure to identify her provided the perfect retroactive justification for his violence. You hear that? Tate whispered harshly in her ear, his knee digging into the back of her thigh. Nobody knows you here. You don't belong here. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs bit into Elena's wrists, ratcheted down so tightly they instantly cut off the circulation to her fingers. Tate hauled her roughly off the hood of the car, spinning her around to face him. Her suit was ruined, torn at the seam. Her hair was disheveled and a thin trail of blood leaked from the corner of her mouth. A second patrol car came screaming around the corner, its sirens wailing, completely shattering the tranquility of the neighborhood. Two more officers jumped out, their hands hovering over their weapons, ready to back up their brother in blue. What do we got, Harlan? The older of the two officers asked, shining a flashlight directly into Elena's tear-streaked, furious face. Caught her casing the neighborhood. Tate lied effortlessly, not even a tremor in his voice. When I asked for ID, she became belligerent, slipped away, tried to flee into the house, and then assaulted me. Caught me right in the jaw. Elena stared at him, horrified. Tate had a faint red mark on his chin, likely from where he had scraped it against her blazer buttons when he tackled her. It was a masterclass in staging a narrative. "I am a USA Elena Whitaker," she said to the newly arrived officers, her voice shaking with rage, not fear. "My badge is in the car. This officer assaulted me, unprovoked. Check the dashboard camera. Check his body cam." The older officer glanced at Tate. Tate merely tapped the black square affixed to the center of his chest. "Crazy thing," Tate said with a smirk. "Battery died about 20 minutes ago. Been meaning to swap it out." Elena's stomach dropped into an icy abyss. The classic malfunction. She knew exactly what was happening. She had prosecuted corrupt cops before. She knew the playbook. Without footage, it was a sworn police officer's word against a black woman in handcuffs. The fact that she was a federal prosecutor suddenly felt terrifyingly irrelevant. They shoved her into the back of the cruiser. As the door slammed shut, caging her behind the thick plexiglass partition, she looked out the window. Her neighbors were standing on their lawns now, watching in silent judgment as the criminal was hauled away. Her legal documents, months of meticulous work on the syndicate case, were still blowing across the driveway, fluttering away into the darkness. The holding cell at the precinct smelled intensely of bleach, stale sweat, and human misery. Elena sat on the rigid stainless steel bench, her hands resting in her lap. They had finally removed the cuffs, leaving deep purple and red grooves etched into her skin. She had been sitting in the freezing cell for hours without being allowed a phone call. She was not panicked. She was calculating. She knew that the moment she did not show up for her morning briefing at the federal building, alarms would sound. Her boss, United States Attorney Everett Lang, would track her down. Lang was a political animal, sure, but he was also a mentor. He had personally assigned her to the syndicate case. He would walk into this precinct, tear Tate a new one, and have the charges dropped before the sun fully rose. Hours later, the heavy metal door to the cell block clanged open. Elena stood up, straightening her ruined jacket, preparing to leave. Everett Lang walked down the corridor. He was a tall, impeccably tailored man with silver hair and a perpetual expression of calculated diplomacy. But as he approached the bars of her cell, Elena noticed that he was not looking at her with outrage or concern. He was looking at her with profound, guarded distance. Behind Lang stood a man Elena recognized instantly, Dominic Russo, a high-priced defense attorney who frequently represented the local police union. "Everett," Elena said, gripping the bars. "Thank God. Get me out of here. This entire precinct needs to be placed under federal investigation by noon. Tate assaulted me, filed a false report, and—" "Elena, stop," Lang interrupted, his voice hushed and unnervingly flat. He glanced nervously at the guard standing at the end of the hall. "Just listen to me." "Listen to you?" Elena's brow furrowed. "I was attacked on my own property." Lang sighed, running a hand over his jaw. "The police union is already mobilizing, Elena. They're drawing up the charging documents right now. They aren't just charging you with resisting arrest or disorderly conduct. They're charging you with aggravated assault on a police officer. A felony." Tate went to the hospital. He's claiming a torn rotator cuff and a concussion. "He's lying!" Elena yelled, her voice bouncing off the concrete walls. "He tackled me! He's fabricating injuries to cover up a bad stop." "It doesn't matter what the truth is right now," Russo chimed in smoothly, stepping forward. "What matters is what the press is going to see." Tate's dashboard camera from his cruiser caught the audio and a partial visual. "It doesn't look good, Ms. Whitaker. It shows you refusing orders, turning away, and a physical scuffle ensuing." "Because he grabbed me." Lang looked at the floor. unable to meet her eyes. Elena, the mayor's office called me 20 minutes ago. The police union is threatening a wildcat strike if the U.S. Attorney's Office tries to flex federal jurisdiction to bury a cop-beater case. We're in the middle of an election year. The optics. Elena felt the air evacuate from the room. She stared at the man who had sat at her dining room table, who had praised her intellect and tenacity. The optics, she repeated, the words tasting like ash. You're throwing me to the wolves over optics? I am placing you on indefinite administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal investigation, Lang said, reverting to his cold bureaucratic persona. I can't interfere in a local jurisdiction's felony assault case against one of my own prosecutors. It's a conflict of interest. You're going to need private counsel. He turned to walk away. The betrayal was so absolute, so swift, it was dizzying. Everett, she called out. He stopped, but did not turn around. Suddenly, a horrifying realization crystallized in Elena's mind. The missing files, the syndicate case, the fentanyl ring she was investigating, had suspected ties to local law enforcement. She had been pulling financial records of several officers in the precinct. This wasn't a random stop, Elena whispered, her voice carrying through the quiet cell block. Tate. He knew who I was. He was waiting for me. They wanted my briefcase. They wanted to discredit me. Lang finally turned his head, looking back at her over his shoulder. The expression on his face was not denial. It was a terrifying, quiet confirmation. He knew, and he was too scared of the political fallout to do anything about it. Get a good lawyer, Elena, Lang said softly. The system doesn't forgive people who end up on the wrong side of the glass. As Lang and Russo walked out, leaving her in the cold, echoing silence of the cell, Elena realized she was not just fighting for her career anymore. She was fighting for her freedom, against a machine she had helped build. A machine that had just decided to eat her alive. Elena's life savings evaporated in days. Retaining Silas Grant, the only private defense attorney in the state with a reputation vicious enough and a baseline cynical enough to take on the local police union and the district attorney's office simultaneously, cost her everything she had accumulated over a decade of public service. Grant was a brilliant, perpetually exhausted cynic who viewed the American justice system not as a balanced scale, but as an industrial meat grinder. They sat in Grant's cramped, dimly lit downtown office, surrounded by towering, precarious stacks of cardboard discovery boxes. Grant tossed a thin manila folder onto the scarred mahogany desk, the paper slapping against the wood with a depressing thud. They are completely stonewalling us on the syndicate files, Val, Grant grunted. He rubbed his bloodshot eyes, staring at the meager police report. Everett Lang and the U.S. Attorney's Office issued a formal statement. They claim your leather briefcase was recovered at the scene with all documents intact. However, the specific financial ledger logs, the ones you said linked the precinct to the cartel's money laundering operations, are miraculously unaccounted for. The official line is that they were blown away or misplaced during the chaotic physical altercation in your driveway. They didn't blow away, Silas, Elena stated, her voice stripped of its usual warmth, replaced by a brittle, hardened edge that terrified even her. Tate's backup officers swept the driveway before the actual crime scene unit arrived. They stole the evidence. Tate didn't just profile me. He neutralized a federal threat to his own illicit income. I believe you, Grant sighed, leaning back in his squeaking leather chair. But belief isn't admissible in court. Evidence is. And Judge Patricia Lang just ruled on our pretrial motions. She granted the prosecution's motion in limine. We are strictly forbidden from bringing up your RICO investigation, the missing files, or any theories of a police conspiracy during the trial. She deemed it highly prejudicial, speculative, and irrelevant to the specific charge of aggravated assault. If we even hinted at it, she'll hold me in contempt and declare a mistrial. Elena felt the air evacuate from the room. They had successfully gagged her. They were going to try her in a vacuum, stripping away all context, all motive for the police framing her, leaving only the narrative of a hysterical, violent black woman attacking a decorated police officer. The trial began months later, and the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like an execution chamber. The gallery was packed tightly with off-duty police officers sitting shoulder to shoulder in a silent, intimidating wall of solidarity for Harlan Tate. The district attorney, a slick, politically ambitious man named Dominic Russo, paraded his witnesses before the jury with theatrical precision. The most devastating blow came not from the police, but from Elena's own neighbor. Martha Ellison took the witness stand, her floral dress perfectly pressed, her hands clasped demurely in her lap. Under Russo's gentle, coaxing examination, Martha painted a picture of absolute terror. "I heard shouting," Martha testified, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "I looked out my front window and saw this aggressive woman. She was screaming, flailing her arms. Officer Tate was just trying to calm her down, speaking so softly, but she wouldn't listen. She just snapped. I saw her lunge at him, striking him right in the face. It was horrifying. We moved here to get away from this kind of violent behavior." "Objection!" Grant roared, slamming his palm on the defense table. "Prejudicial language and speculation." "Sustained," Judge Lang said smoothly, barely looking up from her notes. "The jury will disregard the witness's last sentence. However, the testimony regarding the physical strike remains." Grant tore into Martha on cross-examination, exposing her poor eyesight, the darkness of the street, and the fact that she was viewing the scene from over 80 feet away through a pane of glass. He forced her to admit that Elena had helped her find her dog, attempting to show that Martha knew exactly who Elena was and had lied to the police out of prejudice. But the damage was done. Martha's tearful demeanor played perfectly to the jury, who looked at the older woman with deep, uncritical sympathy. Then came Harlan Tate. He wore his Class A dress uniform, his chest adorned with commendations. He spoke with a quiet, humble restraint that made Elena's blood boil. He described his injuries: a torn rotator cuff and a severe concussion, claiming he had suffered crippling migraines ever since Elena brutally attacked him. "I was simply asking for identification to ensure the safety of the neighborhood, sir," Tate told the jury, looking earnestly into the jury box. "I treat everyone with the same respect." Ms. Whitaker became immediately hostile, utilized her knowledge of the law to try and intimidate me. And when that failed, she resorted to sudden extreme violence. Grant's cross-examination of Tate was a masterclass in aggressive litigation. But it was like punching a brick wall. Tate had clearly been coached by the police union's best fixers. He deflected, he remained calm, and he repeatedly leaned on the fact that his body camera had malfunctioned. A tragic coincidence, he claimed, that robbed the court of seeing the truth. "Isn't it true, Officer Tate," Grant pressed, stepping out from behind the podium, "that you recognized Ms. Whitaker the moment you pulled up? That you targeted her specifically because she was investigating your precinct?" "Objection!" Dominic Russo shouted, leaping to his feet. "Violation of the pretrial orders. Counsel is deliberately introducing excluded, baseless conspiracy theories." "Sustained," Judge Lang barked, her eyes flashing with genuine anger. "Mr. Grant, I warned you. One more outburst like that and you will be spending the night in the county jail, and I will instruct the jury to draw negative inferences from your conduct." Elena sat frozen at the defense table. She was watching her life be dismantled, piece by piece, by the very rules of evidence and procedure she had wielded against cartels and murderers. The system was functioning exactly as it was designed to, protecting its own, silencing the accused, and prioritizing procedural compliance over actual verifiable truth. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own profession's making, suffocating under the weight of perjured testimony and judicial complicity. Against Grant's strong advice, Elena insisted on taking the witness stand. She knew the risks. She knew that Dominic Russo would attempt to dissect her character, to paint her as an arrogant, entitled attorney who thought she was above the law. But she could not sit silently while her life was stolen. She had to speak her truth, even if the courtroom had been structurally engineered to ignore it. Taking the oath, Elena looked directly at the jury. They were predominantly white, older, and visibly uncomfortable making eye contact with her. "I did not strike Officer Tate," Elena testified, her voice clear, resonant, and unwavering. "I was exhausted. I was carrying legal files. He demanded identification, and when I informed him my purse was in the car, he ordered me not to move. I complied. When I stated I was going into my own home, he initiated extreme, unprovoked physical force. He grabbed my clothing, swept my legs, and slammed my face into the hood of my vehicle. I was the victim of an assault that night, not the perpetrator." Russo's cross-examination was swift and vicious. He did not attack her version of the events directly. Instead, he attacked her demeanor. He used her legal background against her, twisting her knowledge of her rights into an accusation of arrogance. "You're an assistant U.S. attorney, Ms. Whitaker," Russo said, pacing before the jury. "You know how police stops work. You know that compliance is paramount for safety. Yet you admit you argued with the officer. You admit you turned your back on him to walk to your house. You felt the rules didn't apply to you because of your badge, didn't you? You felt insulted that a patrolman dared to question you in your wealthy neighborhood." "I felt terrified," Elena corrected him sharply, "because a man with a gun was screaming at me on my own property without lawful justification." "Justification is for the courts, Ms. Whitaker, as you well know," Russo sneered. "Not the driveway." The closing arguments were a study in agonizing contrasts. Grant passionately pleaded with the jury to see through the blue wall of silence, to recognize the convenient lack of camera footage, and to look at the sheer absurdity of a federal prosecutor throwing her career away to punch a cop. Russo, in turn, wrapped himself in the flag and the thin blue line, portraying Tate as a working-class hero simply trying to protect a neighborhood from an entitled, violent elitist who thought her race and her job made her untouchable. The jury deliberated for several days. Every hour that ticked by in the bleak, windowless holding room adjacent to the courtroom chipped away at Elena's sanity. On the afternoon of the final day, the buzzer sounded. A verdict had been reached. Walking back into the courtroom, the air felt thick, almost unbreathable. The off-duty officers in the gallery sat in stony, expectant silence. Elena stood next to Grant, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she felt physically ill. She stared at the jury foreperson, an older man in a checkered shirt who held a single sheet of paper. "In the matter of the state versus Elena Whitaker," the foreperson read, his voice painfully loud in the silent room. "On the charge of aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer, we find the defendant guilty." A collective muffled sigh of relief rippled through the police officers in the gallery. Elena did not gasp. She did not cry. She simply stopped feeling anything at all. A cold, absolute numbness washed over her, freezing her blood. Grant placed a heavy, defeated hand on her shoulder, muttering curses under his breath. The sentencing hearing was scheduled weeks later. The probation department, heavily influenced by the DA's office, recommended the maximum penalty. They cited her lack of remorse and the need to send a strong message that no one, not even a federal prosecutor, is above the law. Judge Patricia Lang looked down at Elena from the elevated bench, her expression devoid of any human empathy. "Ms. Whitaker," Judge Lang began, adjusting her reading glasses, "your actions on that night were a disgrace to the legal profession. You abused your position. You violently attacked a public servant who was merely performing his duties, and throughout this trial, you have shown absolutely no contrition. opting instead to cast baseless conspiratorial aspersions on the police department. Society must be protected from individuals who react to lawful authority with such brazen, unchecked violence. Elena stood tall, refusing to let them see her break. "Your Honor, I am innocent. This court has facilitated a profound miscarriage of justice to protect corrupt officers. That is exactly the kind of unrepentant arrogance that brings us here today," Judge Lang snapped, striking her gavel. "Elena Whitaker, I sentence you to 8 years in the state penitentiary without the possibility of parole for the first 5 years. You are remanded into the immediate custody of the sheriff's department." The sound of the heavy metal handcuffs clicking around Elena's wrists was the loudest sound in the world. It was the same sound she had heard in her driveway, but this time it was final. 2 bailiffs grabbed her by the arms. As they turned her around to lead her out of the courtroom, Elena's eyes swept the room. She saw Dominic Russo shaking hands with the police union representative. She saw Harlan Tate, the man who had ruined her life to protect his own crimes, smiling faintly, receiving pats on the back from his fellow officers. And then, standing near the back doors, she saw Everett Lang, her former boss. He had come to watch the execution. When their eyes met, Lang could not hold her gaze. He looked down at the floor, a coward in a tailored suit, complicit in the destruction of an innocent woman. They led Elena through the heavy wooden doors, out of the courtroom, and down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway toward the holding cells. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. In the span of months, she had gone from commanding federal courtrooms to wearing an orange jumpsuit. The heavy steel door of the transport van clanged shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. The engine roared to life, carrying her away from the neighborhood, away from the law she had loved, and into an 8-year void where justice was nothing more than a ghost story told in the dark. The state penitentiary for women was a fortress of rusted iron, crumbling cinder block, and suffocating despair. It existed in a perpetual state of sensory overload, the echoing clang of heavy steel doors, the chaotic shouting from the cell blocks, and the ever-present cloying scent of industrial cleaner, attempting to mask the smell of unwashed bodies and institutional food. For Elena Whitaker, a woman who had previously dictated the fate of criminals from the pristine mahogany tables of federal courtrooms, the transition was nothing short of psychological torture. During her first months, Elena spoke to no one. She existed in a state of catatonic shock, retreating into the deepest corners of her own mind to survive the brutal reality of her incarceration. She was stripped of her tailored suits, her identity, and her dignity, replaced by a shapeless orange jumpsuit bearing the Department of Corrections number. She learned quickly that the justice system she had so faithfully served did not care about truth once the gavel fell. It only cared about processing bodies. But as the first year bled into the second, the shock slowly mutated into a cold, hardened resolve. Elena was a prosecutor. Her entire life had been built on dissecting complex narratives, finding the fatal flaw in an opponent's argument, and fighting relentlessly until the truth was exposed. She realized that sitting in her cell, allowing anger to consume her, was exactly what Harlan Tate and Everett Lang wanted. They wanted her broken. They wanted her erased. She requested a transfer to the prison's law library, a dimly lit, poorly ventilated room filled with outdated legal encyclopedias and dog-eared copies of state statutes. The warden, a stern but pragmatic woman named Patricia Miller, granted the request, hoping Elena's legal expertise would keep the more litigious inmates occupied and quiet. It was within those dusty walls that Elena found her armor. She began drafting habeas corpus petitions, appeals, and civil rights complaints for her fellow inmates. She helped Rosa Alvarez, a young mother serving time on a trumped-up conspiracy charge, get her sentence reduced by identifying a blatant procedural error in the district attorney's filing. She drafted a successful federal lawsuit against the prison for unconstitutional medical negligence on behalf of an elderly inmate. In the microcosm of the penitentiary, Elena Whitaker was no longer just inmate number. She was the silent, formidable force of the law, wielding her intellect like a scalpel. Despite her internal victories, her own case remained a locked vault. Silas Grant, her cynical but fiercely loyal defense attorney, visited her every couple of months. The visits were usually exercises in shared frustration. The appellate courts routinely rubber-stamped Judge Patricia Lang's rulings, refusing to overturn the conviction based on the overwhelming witness testimony and the strict adherence to pre-trial evidentiary exclusions. Years into Elena's sentence, the heavy steel door of the visitation room clanged open. Elena sat down behind the scratched plexiglass partition, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver. When she looked up, she noticed an immediate difference in Grant. He was not wearing his usual expression of exhausted defeat. His tie was loosened, his eyes were wide, and he was clutching a thick, expanding file folder with white-knuckled intensity. "I told you not to waste your time driving down here unless you had a miracle, Silas," Elena said, her voice raspy from disuse, yet carrying the sharp, authoritative cadence she had never lost. "I don't have a miracle, Val," Grant replied, his breath hitching slightly as he pressed the folder against the glass. "I have a wrecking ball." Elena leaned forward, the chain of her handcuffs clinking softly against the metal counter. "Talk to me." 3 nights ago, the Drug Enforcement Administration executed a coordinated multi-state raid on the very syndicate you were investigating before you were arrested, Grant began, speaking rapidly, his eyes darting around the visitation room to ensure no guards were lingering too close. A joint task force, spearheaded by an FBI special agent named Jonathan Reed. They hit a major money-laundering stash house just outside the city limits. Elena's heart skipped a beat. The syndicate. The missing files. Did they find something? Grant smiled, a feral, triumphant baring of teeth. They didn't just find drugs, Val. They found the cartel's primary bookkeeping ledger. A physical hardbound book detailing millions of dollars in illicit payouts, bribes, and protection money. "Harrison, I knew about the ledger," Elena interrupted, her frustration momentarily flaring. "That was the core of my RICO case. That was the evidence in my briefcase that Tate stole from my driveway to protect himself. But Judge Lang ruled it inadmissible because we couldn't physically produce it to prove his motive." "Let me finish," Grant insisted, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "The DEA seized the ledger. When Special Agent Reed began processing the physical evidence, he noticed something tucked inside the back cover. It was a cluster of folded, heavily redacted grand jury transcripts. Your transcripts, Val. The exact documents from your stolen briefcase." The air evacuated from Elena's lungs. The concrete walls of the visitation room seemed to dissolve. "There's more," Grant continued, pressing his hand against the plexiglass, as if trying to physically transmit the energy of the revelation. "Reed ran forensic analysis on the ledger and the documents. They pulled 7 distinct high-quality latent fingerprints off those grand jury transcripts. 5 of them belong to you. 2 of them belong to Officer Harlan Tate of the precinct." Elena closed her eyes, a single hot tear tracking down her cheek. It was the first time she had cried since the night of her arrest. It was not a tear of sadness. It was the overwhelming, violent release of years of agonizing injustice. "Tate claimed under oath that he never touched my briefcase," Elena whispered, the legal implications instantly assembling in her mind. "He testified that it blew away in the wind. The prosecution's entire timeline was built on the assertion that the stop was a routine neighborhood patrol." "Exactly," Grant said, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "Tate committed aggravated perjury. The physical evidence proves he stole federal documents from a U.S. attorney to cover up his own inclusion in a cartel's payroll. Special Agent Reed cross-referenced the ledger's payout codes. Tate is listed as receiving thousands of dollars a month to provide the syndicate with police dispatch schedules and blind spots. "What about Everett Lang?" Elena demanded, her eyes snapping open, burning with a cold, unforgiving fire. The betrayal of her former mentor still felt like a knife buried between her ribs. "Lang is panicking," Grant sneered. "The FBI raided the U.S. Attorney's local office this morning. They seized his hard drives and internal communications. It turns out Lang knew about the missing files being linked to Tate within days of your arrest. He actively buried the internal inquiry because he was angling for a federal judgeship and didn't want a police corruption scandal exploding under his watch during an election year. He sacrificed you for a promotion." "So, what is the play?" Elena asked, her mind already shifting from the shock of the revelation to the tactical execution of her revenge. She was not just a victim anymore. She was a prosecutor who had just been handed the ultimate smoking gun. "I'm filing an emergency writ of habeas corpus and a motion to vacate the conviction, based on egregious prosecutorial misconduct, Brady violations, and newly discovered evidence of absolute innocence," Grant explained, tapping the folder. "And we aren't going in front of Patricia Lang because this involves a federal RICO investigation and the obstruction of justice by local police. We managed to get the hearing bumped to the federal district court. We are going before Judge Leonard Carmichael. He hates dirty cops and he despises corrupt prosecutors." "Get me out of this cage, Silas," Elena said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "Get me out of here and I will burn their entire house to the ground." Grant nodded, picking up his briefcase. "Pack your things, counselor. You're going home." The final dramatic legal reckoning unfolded in the federal courthouse downtown, a breathtaking masterpiece of grand neoclassical architecture. Its towering white marble columns projected an aura of unyielding authority. For Elena Whitaker, walking into the courtroom in heavy steel handcuffs and a wrinkled orange prison uniform was the most profoundly humiliating, yet fiercely empowering moment of her entire life. She was no longer just the accused. She was the incoming storm, a force of nature fueled by years of wrongful incarceration. The air outside had been electric, swarming with news crews, journalists, and angry, loud protesters demanding justice. Word had leaked to the press about the explosive nature of this emergency federal hearing. The city collectively held its breath, waiting to see if the impenetrable blue wall of silence was going to finally crumble. Sitting at the heavy mahogany defense table right next to Silas Grant, Elena kept her posture rigidly, perfectly straight. She resolutely refused to look back at the packed gallery behind her. She kept her dark eyes locked dead ahead on the heavy oak doors at the front of the majestic room. When the stern bailiff finally announced the arrival of federal judge Leonard Carmichael, the chaotic, murmuring room instantly fell into a deadly, suffocating silence. Judge Carmichael was an intimidating older man with a legendary reputation for possessing a merciless intellect and harboring absolutely zero tolerance for prosecutorial misconduct. He took his elevated seat at the massive wooden bench, meticulously adjusted his heavy reading glasses, and looked down with narrowed eyes at the immense stack of federal affidavits Silas Grant had boldly filed. The state had sent a junior appellate attorney named Timothy Dalton to defend the rotten falling conviction. Dalton was a perpetually nervous, sweating man who clearly understood with terrifying clarity that he had just been handed a live, unpinned grenade. Dominic Russo, the slick, politically ambitious district attorney who had maliciously prosecuted Elena years earlier, was conspicuously, tellingly absent. The official press release falsely claimed Russo was currently on an indefinite administrative leave, but everyone in the entire legal community knew the hidden truth. He was desperately scrambling to secure his own criminal defense counsel before the federal indictments inevitably dropped. The balance of power in the quiet room had violently shifted forever. "Mr. Grant," Judge Carmichael loudly boomed, his deep, resonant voice echoing off the vaulted, painted ceiling. "I have thoroughly exhaustively reviewed your urgent emergency motions as well as the sealed classified affidavits provided directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The horrific allegations contained herein suddenly represent a catastrophic systemic failure of our entire judicial process. Is the state actually prepared to directly address the physical forensic evidence recently presented by the Drug Enforcement Administration? Timothy Dalton stood up incredibly slowly, his pale, thin hands visibly shaking as he fearfully gripped the hard edges of the wooden prosecution podium. "Your Honor," Dalton stammered, his voice cracking slightly under the immense crushing pressure. "The state respectfully maintains that the original criminal conviction was lawfully secured through highly credible eyewitness testimony. While the sudden discovery of this cartel ledger is admittedly troubling, it does not definitively invalidate Martha Ellison's sworn statements regarding the physical violent altercation." Judge Carmichael's face darkened instantly, his jaw clenching with barely suppressed righteous fury. "Do not dare insult my intelligence in my own courtroom, counsel," Carmichael snapped, his voice cracking like a heavy leather whip. The eyewitness in question was an elderly, frightened woman standing outside. She was exactly 80 feet away in the pitch black of night. The arresting officer's sworn, uncontested testimony was the absolute linchpin of your entire malicious prosecution. That specific officer boldly testified he did not tamper with the defendant's personal property. Carmichael angrily waved his hand, completely dismissing Dalton's pathetic defense, and immediately turned his full, undivided attention to the wooden witness stand. FBI Special Agent Jonathan Reed had just been formally sworn in, sitting with strict military posture, his silver federal badge gleaming brightly against his dark tailored suit. "Agent Reed," Silas Grant softly began, gracefully approaching the center. He walked with the predatory, confident grace of a dangerous shark, finally smelling fresh blood in the dark water. "Can you please explicitly confirm for this federal court exactly what you and your federal task force actually found hidden deep inside the cartel syndicate's master financial ledger?" Agent Reed slowly leaned forward, speaking directly into the small microphone. "Yes, sir," Reed quickly replied, his voice authoritative, crisp and totally unwavering. "During the Dawn raid, we successfully recovered exactly 42 individual pages of highly classified, unredacted federal grand jury transcripts, officially belonging directly to Assistant United States Attorney Elena Whitaker. Exhaustive forensic analysis subsequently conducted by our federal laboratory definitively confirmed the clear presence of Officer Harlan Tate's latent fingerprints on several of those stolen documents. Furthermore, the master ledger itself explicitly, meticulously details recurring monthly wire transfers routing directly to offshore banking accounts intrinsically linked to Officer Tate's brother-in-law. These massive secret payments were explicitly coded as financial compensation in direct exchange for critical, highly sensitive operational police intelligence and daily dispatch schedules. A collective shocked gasp swept rapidly through the packed, sweaty gallery, followed by a frantic, buzzing wave of frightened, whispered disbelief echoing loudly around. The indisputable empirical truth hung heavily in the terribly stale courtroom air, acting as a massive, suffocating weight that instantly crushed the state's entire fabricated narrative into fine dust. "Agent Reed," Silas Grant smoothly continued, mercilessly pressing his massive, insurmountable advantage without demonstrating a single ounce of human mercy. "Based directly upon your exhaustive federal investigation, your forensic analysis, and the recovered communication logs, did Officer Harlan Tate actually initiate a lawful, routine, random neighborhood patrol stop on Ms. Whitaker's private residential property that tragic night?" Agent Reed did not blink once. "No, sir. He absolutely did not," Reed calmly stated. His strong voice loudly rang with absolute chilling finality. Historical cellular tower data definitively confirms that Officer Tate sat perfectly idle, parked exactly 2 quiet blocks away from Ms. Whitaker's residence for over 3 agonizing hours. He was intentionally, maliciously waiting for her to return home from the busy federal building. It was not a random encounter. It was a highly coordinated, targeted, and premeditated ambush, specifically designed to illegally seize the confidential legal files that would have ultimately implicated him deeply in a massive, sprawling federal racketeering enterprise. Silas Grant turned incredibly slowly on his expensive, polished black leather shoes. He deliberately locked his piercing eyes directly with the utterly defeated state's attorney. "I have absolutely no further questions for this specific witness, Your Honor," Grant proudly declared. Timothy Dalton, wisely, quickly declined to formally cross-examine the federal agent. There was absolutely nothing left to ask him today. The entire corrupt foundation of their ugly lies had been spectacularly, publicly atomized. Judge Carmichael looked out over the hushed courtroom. His weathered expression was a complex, heartbreaking mixture of profound disgust, deep sorrow, and righteous anger. He finally let his intense, probing gaze settle softly on Elena for a brief, magical second. For the very first time in years, a sitting judge looked at her not as a convicted, dangerous felon, but as a brilliant, respected colleague who had been brutally, systematically wronged by the exact justice system she truly loved. The American justice system strictly relies upon a fragile, sacred pact of public trust, Carmichael spoke, his powerful voice incredibly heavy with deep emotional solemnity. When those sworn individuals explicitly appointed to protect and uphold the sacred law deliberately weaponized their vast authority to silence legitimate investigators, to fabricate damning physical evidence, and to completely destroy innocent lives, the entire structural foundation of our democratic society rapidly rots from the inside out. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel. Based upon the completely overwhelming, indisputable, and shocking evidence of extreme prosecutorial misconduct, blatant police perjury, and a highly coordinated malicious conspiracy to explicitly obstruct federal justice, I am hereby officially vacating the criminal conviction of Elena Whitaker. All previous charges are hereby permanently dismissed with extreme prejudice. Ms. Whitaker, you are completely unequivocally exonerated of all alleged wrongdoing. Bailiff,
Please, carefully remove those heavy iron cuffs from her wrists immediately so she can freely walk out forever today.
if you were captivated by Elena Whitaker's harrowing journey from top federal prosecutor to wrongfully convicted inmate and her explosive fight to dismantle a corrupt system, make sure to hit that like button. We bring you intense, real-life inspired dramas that expose the darkest corners of the justice system and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Don't let these powerful stories go unheard. Share this video with your friends. Drop a comment below on what you thought of Judge Carmichael's ruling, and hit subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss a thrilling update.